Rebecca's going to record it. Just put it over here. And I pass the floor to you, Miriam.
Okay. Hi, I'm Miriam, and I'm a member of Cocaine Anonymous.
Hi, Miriam.
Yeah, I'm a little nervous to share because I've never done this before in its entirety. But it's nice to know that I'm sharing with friends, and that helps me be a little less nervous about this sort of stuff. Anyways, in my early childhood, I was raised in a very strict religious family. There was a lot of rules and a lot of structure, a lot of things you had to follow. And if you kind of went outside the lines, you were being sinful, and God was going to be the one that was going to judge you. But I also very much learned a double life. My parents were involved in ministry, and so outside of the house, everything was perfect. But in the home, there was anger management problems, marital problems between my parents, and different things like that. So I grew up in a lot of chaos within my home, and yet this persona being put on outside of the home, that things were different than they were. I started doing ballet when I was very young, and succeeded at that. And it was one of the few things in my life that I remember from my early years that would garner positive attention from my parents, because it was something that I was good at. And they were busy. They had 4 kids of their own, and they ran a day home. And so there was always chaos in the house. And that was kind of my escape, was dancing. When I was the summer between grade 6 and grade 7, we moved from Calgary and from our kind of quiet little sheltered world out to a children's camp, and my parents started running a children's camp. I was plunked down into public school for the first time in my life. And all of these things that I'd been told were bad, were now looking like fun. Sneaking out or smoking or drinking or doing drugs, things like that. I was seeing people do them around me and not have consequences. And so I figured, well, if I do them, I'm not going to have those consequences either. Right. It was also within that first year, in Chestermere that my parents started taking in foster kids, and that my mom was diagnosed with manic depression. So that was another whole new level to trying to figure out how to exist in life when you were walking on eggshells, never knowing if my mom was going to be manic or depressed or stable that day. That sort of stuff, and putting foster kids in the mix also added a whole different level of, just people around. Then they weren't raised the same as I was. They didn't have the same beliefs as our family did and stuff like that. And so, in some of those early years, I noticed that my foster sister behaving badly would garner just as much attention as me succeeding in my ballet or in my dancing. I had several accidents and injuries over the years, especially once I got into my teen years. There's not a time as far back as I can remember when there was something ailing me, I wasn't looking for a drug of some sort to make it better. I'd get sick and I'd ask my mom for, Pepto-Bismol, or I'd get a headache and I'd ask my mom for Tylenol, different things like that. And so, I was very much drug seeking, from a young age, and it continued the more that I sustained more serious injuries as a result of my dancing. The first time I was introduced to opioids, I was 14, and I, had torn ligament in my knee, and And it was one of those things where the first time that I put painkillers in my body, I was like, wow, everything is numb. I don't feel this anymore. And I remember thinking that was such an awesome feeling. And so I continued for the whole rest of my life having both real as well as made up injuries in order to be able to get the drugs that I wanted, right? My older sister had started presenting with severe mental health struggles by the time I was about 14 or so. She, 4 years down the line, got diagnosed with a full dissociative identity disorder. So she's multiple. And again, it was one of those things where she'd go off the rockers and she'd cut herself. Both her and one of my foster sisters self-mutilated quite a lot. So I was exposed to that a lot. And again, they would get more attention from my parents for harming themselves than I would get for getting good grades, or I would get for doing the right thing. And so it was this learned pattern where it was like, well, I need to start acting like the bad girl in order to get that kind of attention and different things like that. And so I kind of really swayed from the person that I'd been at the beginning of my life into, how opposite from this can I possibly get? Acting out, starting fights, taking off in the middle of the night with my foster sister, things like that. I would drink at parties, and I would occasionally smoke pot and different things like that. But the mindset that I always had was that as long as I didn't snort something or shoot it, I wasn't a drug addict, right? There wasn't something wrong with me, even though, other people didn't have to, manipulate situations as much as I did in order to keep getting the drugs and alcohol, and in order to keep trying to talk themselves out of the situation. So by the time I was 15, I was being sexually abused by one of my foster sisters. And that started a very deep downward spiral for me. I was also at this time having trouble at school as a result of a different foster sibling who'd kind of taken my peer group away from me. There was death threats over email because there wasn't such things as Facebook back then. And there was, people just always giving me this message that I wasn't good enough and that I should just remove myself from the planet because it would be better that way. The last day that I ever went to school out in Chestermere, I showed up to school and there was a knife in my locker that was positioned so that when I opened it, it would fall towards me. It was just this constant, you're not good enough, you don't matter message in my head that led me down a really, really dark path for a long time there. I was struggling with mental health, but I didn't know it at the time. My parents thought that, my older sister was the one with the mental health issues because she was much further down the borderline spectrum than the rest of us. But it didn't mean that my things didn't matter. It just meant that they were less important, or they weren't recognized the same, right? My parents didn't notice the signs of mental health issues in me because they were so busy dealing with some of my other siblings who had much more severe mental health issues than I did. After I left school, I went and started working at the local restaurant, and that was where I first got introduced to kind of the perks of working in industry, where you didn't have to be 18 necessarily in order to go sit at the bar and drink after your shift. As long as they thought you were 18, they weren't actually going to ask you for your driver's license, different things like that. So that's when I first experienced alcohol. I was about 17. And I was just like, from the moment that I first experienced, from the moment I had my first drink, I felt like I arrived. I felt like I belonged somewhere finally. These people were, wanting me around and were, buying me drinks and different things like that. And I had the ability to manipulate, people. And I learned very quickly how to manipulate people into giving me what I wanted. So by the time I was 17, I had gotten fired from a job and had been arrested from stealing from that workplace. So I was under a court order and different things like that to live with someone that was either my parents or approved by my parents. And so they sent me to live with my aunt and uncle in Calgary, and try a different school and try to get me to finish school, things like that. But for me, being in small town Chestermere, which had no transit, had nothing but a corner store and a couple bars back then, this was my first taste of freedom, right? This was my first taste of being in a city with public transit, being in a place where I could get around on my own and I wasn't dependent on my parents for rides, which meant I could get away with more. So I was always out past curfew and hanging out with the wrong crowd of people. And that's when my second sexual assault happened, at the hands of a guy that I was dating at the time. I said no and he didn't listen. I went to the hospital and reported it afterwards, and my parents and my aunts and uncle and the doctors chose not to believe me. They said that I'd made it all up in my brain, that it was all attention seeking, and again, it was just a big blow to my self-worth and my ability to think of myself as anything other than just one of a million faces, right, with no real importance. There was a lot of different jobs. There was a lot of drinking, a lot of drugs, and stuff like that over the next probably 3 or 4 years. I met my husband during this period of time, and he was just my roommate at first. We lived together for 2 years while I was doing the drinking, drugging, partying thing. And he told me he loved me probably about 6 months after we met, and I didn't believe that was possible. I thought that love was a relationship where you only got something out of the person if you gave something, and that it was something that you had to earn, not something that you were freely given. So it took a long time for me to even believe that it was possible for me to be loved by someone. And even after we started dating and we got married, it was still something that was always in the back of my mind. Over the 2 years that we lived together but weren't actually together, and then the first 4 years of our marriage, there was a lot of mental health stuff starting to really come out, which just spurned the addiction stuff even further and further. I was high on my wedding day. I was high basically every day, but I did still have the ability to stop when I wanted to. And getting high and then seeing the result of how that affected the people around me made me dislike myself so much and think that there was something so incredibly wrong with me, that I would intentionally overdose. I was on quite a lot of prescription medications by this point, and it was too easy for me to just take the entire bottle of absolutely everything I had. And so that happened 6 times in 5 or 6 years, where I just got to such a low point that I took everything I had and then, would call someone to save me kind of at the last moment. And thanks to God, I am still here, especially after that many overdose attempts. In 2007, a month after I was married, my foster sister was killed in a car accident. And that night, I can clearly identify it in my brain, was the night that I lost the power of choice over my drugs and my drinking. I no longer had a choice. I said to myself that I never wanted to be sober again for another minute or another second or another day, because her and I were the ones that had partied together and had done drugs together and different things like that. And so me and my fucked up addict brain was saying, well, when I'm high, I can connect with her spirit more. And so that was my kind of excuse, in order to, keep connected with this sister who had meant so much to me. The pain of that loss, and just all the situations that happened as a result of it, led me to, I'd love to say my last overdose attempt, but it was my second last. And this time there was more permanent damage. I had permanent damage to my heart. And about a month after that, I had a pulmonary embolism for the first time, which was a blood clot in my lung. This ensued in 9 months of bed rest and them giving me every drug on the freaking market. And I was miserable, and yet I was the most comfortable that I'd ever been, because I didn't have to feel the pain of her loss anymore. All I had to do was take some morphine, or take some benzos, or go smoke a joint or whatever, and I didn't have to feel anymore. A lot of the next couple of years are honestly a blur. I remember in 2008 I went to school, thinking that, if I go to college, I'll be able to go and make something of myself. 2 months before the course started, my mother was diagnosed with brain cancer. She passed 9 months later. I had taken a 3-month leave of absence from school, between my class and my clinical, in order to care for her. But honestly, I don't remember a lot of it because I was high through all of it. I was high at school. I was high while I was caring for my mother. I was high the day that she died. And that's kind of my second biggest regret. I remember her clearly saying to me before she passed away that her dying wish for me was that I would be clean and sober. And I was never able to give her that. I was taking a lot of painkillers, and I was muting everything else with the marijuana. So even after she died, I never really experienced her death because I was muting it all with medications. In 2010, finally, I realized that there was something more wrong with me than just grief. There was something more wrong with me than just the traumas of my childhood. And there had been another overdose attempt after a failed affair, where I left my husband for 2 weeks for this guy, and then he decided he didn't want me, and then I overdosed again. And after that one was finally when they got me some help, and I went to DBT. I did 2.5 years in a DBT program, still not sober, and lied to them about that the whole time through, because I thought to myself that at this point that I was so dependent on the medications at that point that I believed my own lie. I said that, I need these medications and they're prescribing them to me. Therefore, they're required. Therefore, they're needed. This isn't me choosing this. This is something that my doctor is telling me I need, and therefore I need it. And there was some level of truth to that, but there was a lot more to it than that when, I had a psychiatrist saying you don't need it. And I was saying, no, you're wrong. That was where, again, I see kind of the delineation, where I wasn't willing to let it go. They tried to send me to treatment, and I said, screw you. I went to detox, and I was dry for about 5 months, from the marijuana at least, but still on all the other pills. And the reason that I chickened out and didn't go to treatment was because I didn't believe that I could live my life comfortably with the small list of medications that they were going to allow me to continue to stay on. I was like, well, that's like 12 of my meds that we have to get rid of in order for me to go to treatment. Screw you. I'm not going to treatment, right? And I went on like that for another 6 years, before I was given a book, one year for my birthday. And after reading this book, it really made me start to question whether or not the stories I was telling myself and whether or not the titles I was defining myself by as, a chronic pain sufferer or someone with BPD or any of the other excuses that I could use in order to continue using, were real or not. And I was just talking to my doctor about this last week, and she still remembers the day that I walked into her office and I said, I'm not sure I need all these medications. And she said, finally. I have been waiting years to hear you say that. So we started the very slow and very painful process of pulling me off 12 addictive substances. We did it using the marijuana management program because I thought that if I just got off the pills, I could still keep using pot and then that would be okay. So I got a medical card for marijuana. But within the year and a half that it took me to get off the pills, I got off the pills all right, but I was smoking $1,500 a month worth of marijuana. So it really wasn't a better option for me. It was just trading one for the other. But it got me sober enough that I was willing to sign the form and say, okay, I'm willing to go to treatment. And so the last drug to go was the marijuana, and that was March 2nd of 2018. When that happened, I was I went to Renfrew and then I went to treatment, and absolutely hated treatment. Hated everyone there, hated the rules, hated that they thought they could control my life better than I could control it, because I had been the one in charge for the longest time. Hated the fact that I was sequestered with a bunch of women, and only women, because women I couldn't manipulate as easy as men. And so that's why I'd always surrounded myself with males before, because I could manipulate them a lot easier. But they were the ones that started making me talk about my past and talk about my traumas and talk about the sexual abuse, and things like that, which I hadn't spoken to anyone about since the day that it happened, and I was told it wasn't real and it didn't happen, that I had made it up in my brain. So that was very helpful for me to at least feel validated in my existence, and like someone for the first time knew my full story and believed me. And I was able to stay sober and stay in treatment almost through the whole thing. I left 5 days before graduation because I, again, decided that I knew better and I had learned everything that I could from their program. Thank you very much. I'll go do this myself. And went back to where I was before. But I was determined to not become a statistic. My husband had left about 6 months before I went to treatment. And it was him actually leaving that was the biggest fear in my life. My biggest fear was losing him, because he was the one person that had shown me unconditional love. It didn't matter that I spent our money on spent our rent money on drugs, and we got evicted from another place. It didn't matter that I had an affair. It didn't matter that I had tried to kill myself 6 times in our marriage. He kept staying beside me, and he kept staying strong for me. And he kept showing up when nobody else would. And so for him to actually leave and say, you are too crazy for me to be around you right now, again, was kind of that kick in the pants that I needed to actually go and actually get everything that I could from the treatment program, and then have that determination to not go back out when I left. when I came out of treatment, like I said, I was determined to not become a statistic. And so I was hitting meetings 4 times a day sometimes, just to try to keep myself sober because I didn't know what else to do. And at that point, I thought that if you just went to meetings, you could stay sober. I started in a different fellowship because I had some early exposure to the big book, but I thought it was just a bunch of prayers and a bunch of preaching, and a bunch of garbledy-gook, that was, basically, I thought it was a cult. It was, it was just a bunch of, it was another religion, right? And I wanted nothing to do with religion, because of my early upbringing. Religion was just a two-faced lie to me. Right? My parents had been religious their whole life and looked perfect on the outside, but I saw what was really in their hearts and what life was really like. And so religion to me was a bold-faced lie. And this came across as a religion. So I went to a different fellowship that didn't talk about God and didn't talk about a book, and stuff like that. And thought that I was okay there, for a couple weeks. And then I was brought to my first CA meeting, and by a girl that I'd met in this other fellowship. And she said, well, I'm chairing this meeting tonight. Why don't you just come check it out, right? And I thought I wouldn't fit because I had never really done cocaine. I'd tried it a couple times, but it wasn't really my forte. So I was like, well, how am I going to fit in Cocaine Anonymous? I've never done cocaine, because I was always much more into the downers than the uppers anyways. And she's like, well, just come check it out, right? You never know. She said, it's for all the drugs, anything mind altering, like just come see, right? And I asked a question in that meeting. And when I asked the question, there was people in that room that were answering my question, but they weren't telling me about their lives. They were reading out of this big blue book that I thought I hated. I had such a bias against the big book, that I didn't think any of it could relate to me. And here were these two guys reading to me from this book and answering my life question from a book that was written 80 years ago. And that made no sense to me. So I started to question, whether or not, this spiritual program could be for me. And as the more that I asked questions and the more that I talked to people and stuff like that, I really felt this prompting on my heart that that was what I needed. I needed to accept spirituality, not religion, but spirituality back into my life. So I switched fellowships and I got a sponsor through the CA program. She was very young, in the program. I was her first sponsee, I believe. And we kind of just tried to figure out things together. It wasn't perfect. I sat on my step 4 for way too long because, again, I was not ready to look at my life. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to look at what I'd done, and I really didn't want to have to apologize to anyone. Because at this point still, they were all in the wrong. I was right. They were wrong. And no one was going to tell me otherwise. So as I was going through my steps, my sponsor also voluntold me into service about a month in. She was going back to school and was surrendering one of her service positions, and she goes, oh yeah, but by the way, my new sponsee is going to do this. And I'm like, what? So I didn't even know what it was at that point. But without even really knowing it, I became a unity rep for a group. And that started the ball rolling. It started a big ball rolling where for the first time I had people counting on me, and I had responsibility, and I had accountability, and it was people that I actually respected them enough to be accountable to. Everyone that I met, well, not everyone, but most of the people that I met in the rooms had something that I wanted, right? They had this spark in them, this light in them that I had never seen in any church or in any, team or in any sport, that I ever had been exposed to before. And it was this tantalizing thing that I wanted. And so I was going to do everything that I had to in order to get that. I became a little bit of a service junkie within my first year. I at one point had 9 service positions, I think. But then some of my physical health stuff started to catch up to me, and I had to pull back a bit. But even in then, I knew enough about the program at that point that I didn't make the decision to step back from any service position without consulting God first. I, through the experience of working my steps, had come to believe in a God of my own understanding, which wasn't as hard for me to grasp as I thought it was going to be. I always knew there was a power bigger than me out there. I just thought for a lot of my teen years that because I was behaving so badly, God was going to want nothing to do with me, and that I didn't deserve God. And so I didn't act with any sort of moral compass, because God wasn't going to want me, right? Sorry, just checking here. Yeah, I had just finished my steps, and my sponsor was going through some life struggles, and she wasn't able to sponsor me anymore, and so I found a second sponsor, and with the help of people in the fellowship. I pretty clearly remember it that, I was sitting in a room going, well, my sponsor's not really getting a hold of me. And there was another lady saying, well, I don't really have many sponsees right now, and I'm not sure if I should. And a third person piped up and goes, so I guess you two are meeting next week, right? So, and that really was a life-changing moment for me, because again, it was something where God stepped in, where I had no longer knew what I was supposed to do. And God stepped in, and put someone in my path, that was able to continue to be that guide and continue to be that support to me, as I started to sponsor other people, and as I started to, kind of come back to real life, right? Working on my marriage, working on finding a job, working on all these different things, but having to do them sober and doing them, again, with a different moral compass on life, not just doing it the cheap, easy way, but going through life on kind of a different plane. I don't really know much else. I guess, what it's like now is, I'm just over 18 months, and it's not been easy. I went through the death of my grandmother a couple months ago, and that was harder for me, I think, even than the death of my mom, because I had to feel it all. I couldn't run away, and I couldn't hide from the feelings that I was having. I had to just experience them and just let them be what they were. But I have my husband back, and we have a relationship that's healthier than it's ever been. And starting my own business. I'm getting my health situations under control. I went through a surgery and stayed sober through all of that. So God's showing up in a lot of places where previously I would have not even asked him to be, right? I was happy being numb to the world. I was happy being numb to emotion. I was happy not feeling things. But one thing I definitely notice now is that in numbing all the pain and the hurt, I was numbing all my joy as well. I wouldn't really belly laugh. I wouldn't really allow myself to get excited about things. And it was just this And now I've got this full range of emotions where I can experience deep sadness, but I can also experience deep joy. And that's been a joy to have. Is this sense that life can be both bad and good at the same time. There isn't a one or the other. It doesn't have to be either the worst possible situation or the best possible situation. It's okay to be in the middle, and it's kind of okay to flip back and forth a million times a day too. I'm definitely more centered and more whole now than I've been in my life. I have a sense of peace that I carry with me at all times. And again, it doesn't mean that things, that bad things have stopped happening, but it means that I can accept them now and deal with them as they come, instead of feeling like I need to run away from them. I've got service responsibilities that matter to me now, that I can do with my full heart, and really feel committed to, instead of just feeling like I'm filling a spot. And I have a really, really good fellowship of people around me as well. Even more than I guess I realized, right? Going through something like the death of my grandmother really kind of showed me who was in my corner, right? With who was reaching out and who was wanting to chat and who was checking on me, and things like that. I'm thankful for this program. I'm thankful for recovery and not just sobriety. It makes me a happier, healthier, more whole person. And looking forward to many, many more years of continuing to grow, because I'm definitely far from perfect. And I think all of us are kind of in the same boat with that, where, we can strive for greatness, but we're still human. So thanks. That's all I have.
Well, thank you so much, Miriam.